Hi, welcome back to our penultimate video on the flood story. This is number 42 and we began with number 31, and we'll conclude next time with an overview of what we've seen. And one of the themes that we've been looking at throughout here is how the character of God is revealed to be something other than what perhaps some Christian doctrinal views have understood of God. And if we read the Genesis story in its own context, both in terms of how the narrative is unfolded and in the cultural context of the Babylonian exile and its own flood stories, we see a very different understanding of God here than we might have come in with. And that includes what we see in this final passage. So let's go back and look at some of the basic framework of what we've been doing throughout this journey through the flood story, and then we'll look closely at our passage today. So our passage today is 9:8-17, and I have on the left side of the screen starting in verse 7, which we ended with last time, and I'll go back to that in a minute and show you why. But here on the right side of the screen is the traditional breakdown of chapters 6 to 9 into their J, or as they're called sometimes now, non-P and P flood stories. And so we saw that the J version, which is of course embedded as we have it in the Bible together with the P version, but when you separate it out, it ends with 8:20 and 22, the question of sacrifice, and the P version we're on here ends with this section 9:1-17, which we're looking at in two pieces. So that's one aspect of what we've been looking at all along. In addition, the structure of the whole story we've been looking at is shaped into these various chiastic or other patterns. A chiasm, if you're not familiar, as you can see here, is where the beginning and the end parts mirror, and the central part is what's really brought into focus, like a bullseye target for archery. And so we see down near the bottom, the B prime part we've been working through in two sections now, this section of the fourth divine speech covenant, which parallels the violence and creation section back in 6:11-12. And that traditional conclusion, which is technically not part of the flood story as such, is still part of the story of Noah and his sons, and that mirrors the part of the beginning of the transitional introduction of Noah and his sons. So that's one way to look at it. Another way is through Wenham's chiasm, which we've also been looking at here, where he links the end of the J story with the P story here. His consistent theme is to read it as a complete unit and not worry too much about the different authors, the different source authors. And then Cassuto, in sets of two 6-paragraph units, we see he overlaps these last two pieces into the covenant and the sign, but I'm going to include those together for reasons that we'll see today. One of the poignant aspects of this passage, and I'd like to bring up this piece from Robert Newson, you can see him there, a scholar who's been working in the Bible for over 40 years. He got his PhD in 1980, and one thing he notes in this article, as you can see at the top, published in 2021, so just very recently, is how recently scholars are noting what I hope by the end of this video you'll see is obvious, that this covenant between God and Noah is not just about human beings and God, but emphasizes over and over it's with all created beings. So his writing that just in 2021, highlighting how that's a notion that scholars are just beginning to really come to grips with, and it has great consequences for how we see human relationships with the earth and with God, and that's some of what we'll look at in the final concluding video next time. Other things we've been looking at throughout is how the story includes many Hebrew words that are unique to the flood story, and today it's the word for clouds, but if you haven't been looking at this, you can see all these different words highlighting that the flood story uses a vocabulary different from the rest of Genesis. Perhaps they originally were freestanding stories. We can't know that. Perhaps some of this is adapting language from the Mesopotamian stories, whether that's Gilgamesh or the others that have their own flood stories, as we've been looking at as well. So those are some of the themes we've been looking at throughout. Today we're going to focus on this particular passage, but to do it I want to look back at just briefly at verse 7 and what we saw last time. So bringing up last time, here was the shape of that text, and you'll see how similar that is in a certain way to what we're looking at today. So it starts with God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, and we see here in verse 8 today, and then God said to Noah and his sons with him. So they both sections start with the narrator noting that God is now turning to speak to Noah. And of course there's no break here. God was speaking to Noah here in verse 7, is continuing to speak again. So that's a standard way that the authors establish a new unit here. But in this unit, we saw this was about what God is saying is different about human relationships with non-human beings and among all living beings after the flood. So God's speaking to them about what will be different in this new way of being for them. But what we're going to see today is it's going to be what's different for God, as it starts here, as for me. So our section today will focus on what God's saying is going to be different about God as a result of this experience. And so we look at the shape of this one overall, you see like the last one here, you can see here is framed by be fruitful and multiply, there and here, and this is framed by the covenant. I am establishing my covenant, and then at the end, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established. So this is about what God is choosing to do here. And one of the things that I want to draw attention to right away, and we'll look at it in detail, is how the text emphasizes over and over and over again with all. With every living being, the Hebrew kal here, sometimes translated every, and sometimes translated as all, as in all flesh here. But it's unbelievable how many times we see it here. The Hebrew word kal that you can see here is used 12 times in this section. 12 times to highlight the allness of what's going on here. And so we're going to look at that more closely, but one theme I really want to focus on here is what this change, this post-flood reality, is saying about the character of God and the relationship of God and humans and all creation after this. For as we saw early on, I'm following the notion from scholar Ted Hebert, who suggests, and I think it's a solid notion, that the division in Genesis traditionally between the primeval history in chapters 1 to 11 and the family story, starting with the call of Abram in chapter 12, is the major division of the book of Genesis. But he suggests it's really the division is before and after the flood. And I think these videos have shown at least my understanding of the evidence that supports his view, which is that after the covenant here and this sign, there's a new relationship. It's a new creation and new terms. And so some of what we see before no longer applies, and that's a key point. The covenant is established here. So let's look at that by starting with verse 7. So we didn't look at this in the last video, so I want to start with it now. So this framing language, and you be fruitful and multiply, abound on the earth and multiply it, is missing something, two things from chapter 1, verse 28, which it's echoing, which is this. We saw God bless them as God blessed Noah at the beginning of chapter 9. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, using the Hebrew word kabosh, and have dominion, using the word redu here, over all the animals, etc. And so we don't see that here. And I'd like to suggest that the absence there is certainly intentional, and it's suggesting part of the change in the character of God is God had, like a parent with little children, had trusted them with the boundaries that were given. I give you the garden and I give you plenty to eat. Just don't eat from that one tree and all will be good. But humans could not stay within the boundaries, often as little children can't. And so God, disappointed, has to have new conditions here where there's more rules and more framework to keep the children here, the humans, acting within the bounds of respecting creation. But that involves a change in God's behavior as well, as we'll see. So what God is withholding now from human beings is the authority to have dominion and over the animals of the earth and to subdue it. And one of the great ironies we'll look at in the concluding video next time is modern people, meaning in the last 200 years, who want to use the Bible to justify resource extraction, whether that's of animal hides or animal meat or of gold or whatever it might be, often read Genesis 1 as God has made the earth and given humans the power to do whatever we want with it. And arguments against that, whether that's on the basis of climate change or species loss or other things, often go back to chapter 1 and argue there. But I'd like to suggest that's missing the point. That in Genesis 9, God has taken back that authority. It no longer exists. Human beings are no longer given authority to subdue the earth. Instead, God is in direct covenant relationship with all living things. And so, in other words, humans are no longer given responsibility or authority over the creatures. God is now going to rule directly over humans and all creatures equally. So if we're going to use this passage to argue about God's intentions about the earth, and we'll look at that again next time, we should start from Genesis 9 rather than Genesis 1 is one aspect here. And as we go into this passage, notice, as I was already suggesting, this is all as for me. God said to Noah and his sons, as for me. So what God's doing different. And I'd like to suggest in terms of the character of God, as we saw, both with the acceptance of Noah's offering of the death of all those animals, the clean animals after the flood. 2 videos ago, we looked at how the first thing that Noah does after the flood is kill all the clean animals, and the smell goes up, and God approves of it. It's soothing to God. And then in the last passage, we saw how God allows for the death penalty, or at least restricts violence to one for one rather than allow it to get out of control. That's saying not only something about humans, but saying something about God. Because the flood story implicates God in reacting to violence. As the impetus for the flood, as we saw in chapter 6, was humans had established violence across the earth, and so God establishes more violence across the earth. Which would say in many ways, God is acting like Cain, or Cain's descendant Lamech, in responding to an injury with increased violence in the hope that that would solve the problem. And what we see in this passage is God promising not to do that anymore. That God is learning from God's own experience of how to manage this creation, especially human beings who have the freedom, as we are in the image of God, to make our own choices, and that if God is going to honor that, God has to provide a framework, but can't react the way we react. It's really quite a startling thing about the ongoing journey of growth of God and human beings in this relationship together. That may go against whatever theology you might have come in about, but we're just trying to read Genesis on its own terms, and how you incorporate that into what you believe is obviously up to you. So let's look at this more closely as we go. And I framed this here around the framing aspects of the covenant, but also broken this up into a couple of pieces. And I'm not claiming in any way this is, quote, the right way or the only way, because as we'll see, the language is so poetic and repetitive that one could draw all kinds of lines and spirals connecting different pieces of this together. In fact, in one version of the chiasm, it doesn't go from 12 to 17. It starts here, and this entire section is part of the A part. That would be one way to do it, and I'm not suggesting otherwise. But what I want to emphasize are these two elements. First, the establishing of the covenant, and then what the sign of the covenant is and how those pieces fit together. So, as for me, I am establishing my covenant, Komberit. Notice it's establishing, not cutting the covenant. A common way of talking about covenants in the Bible is that they're cut, and that means they take place between two people. But this is not a bilateral situation. This is just God doing it unilaterally. And nothing is being asked of human beings, unlike the covenant in chapter 17, where God asks Abraham to circumcise himself and all the males with him, or in the Exodus covenant, where there's a whole set of conditions that Moses brings down from Mount Sinai for this new relationship between God and Israel as a nation. Here it's unilateral. So this is not a covenant cut in that sense, worked out together. It's established. It's literally standing up, put up here, with you and your seed after you. And in the translation I have on the right side, you'll see it's a little different. Here it has descendants, and I'll move it down so you can see the parallel, so you can see where I've tried to translate it a little more literally so the pieces can match in ways that the New Revised and other translations often cover over. So as for me, I'm establishing my covenant with you and your seed after you, and with every living being. And this phrase we'll see repeated in various forms, kal nefesh chahaya, that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, etc. But note a couple things. Every living being that is with you, not separate, not the living beings that aren't you and your family separate, but with you. And we'll see the emphasis of that as we go. The birds, the domestic animals, and every living being of the earth. And notice throughout this section, ha'eretz, the earth, is the emphasis, as opposed to last time the Adamah was in relation to the human Adam. Both attributed, as most scholars say, from the P author, so there's no sense that Adam is one author and or Adamah is one author used for the earth and ha'eretz is another. The P author here uses both of them. But in this section, it's plainly ha'eretz, the earth. So every living being of the earth with you, a second time with you, every living being that came out of the ark. So in this first verse, three times, the emphasis on every living being, and the identical phrases you see here. Hard to imagine how it's missed, but we see what we want to see and we hear what we want to hear. Then we hear, I establish my covenant with you. Again, the second time we're repeating that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And this phrase, flood to destroy, is repeated down here, as you can see. The earth. So what are we hearing here? Why is God telling this to Noah? Again, nothing is required of Noah. Noah doesn't have to agree with anything. This is simply about God. I'd like to suggest that this is part of God's reaction to God's behavior here. even though the text doesn't say it explicitly. And so I'm not saying this is what it means, but of course biblical midrash has always tried to fill in the pieces that the authors didn't leave out. So perhaps we can put it in that category. That God has looked at what God has done, and not only has regretted making human beings in the first place, but now regretted engaging in this massive reactive violence that hasn't changed anything. And so whether you think of that as like an abusive spouse or some other power figure, abusive boss who's let their power go to their head in massive violence and then thinks, what have I done? Now God is promising over and over, I promise you I won't do it again. Let me enter into this new relationship with you, and I promise I'll never do it again. Now we know that those promises can be questionable, and yet if we as human beings are to enter into a relationship with God, the Genesis text is saying we have to try again. One of the things that we see about the character of God throughout the Hebrew Bible is God doesn't give up on Israel, even when Israel's wildly unfaithful, going after other gods or seeking power in kings, etc., that God doesn't quit. And so now, for the first time, God is asking human beings in a way, don't quit on me because I promise not to ever do this to you again. And here's the sign of that. And I want to look at that a little more closely here, because as my note here has a sign, ot is the key word here, and we can see that chiasm there. I guess I won't focus on it there. I want to focus on it here to name a couple other things that are going on. So the sign of a covenant. Not all covenants have signs, as some scholars have noted, but the sign is usually meant to be the expression, just like circumcision is the sign of the covenant with Abraham, and the Sabbath is the sign of the covenant with Israel, an expression of something that people do to remember. And yet this is not something for people to do. This is something that God will do. And so we have to look at that a little more closely, and we will right now. So this is the sign of the covenant, and notice the covenant image being repeated throughout here. How many times we see covenant and sign of the covenant right down here too. So this is the sign of the covenant that I give, and notice that's different here than I make, between me and you and every living being that is with you. Third time we're hearing with you, for all future generations. And I put future in the purple here because it's the word olam, although generations door is a different word. Notice how that matches down here. The everlasting covenant, the covenant olam, matches the future generations olam. So this is with everything for always. Nothing vitiates this covenant, God is saying. I promise forever that I will live by the terms of this. And here's the sign. My bow I have given in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I cloud the clouds, literally, if we look here in verse 14, we see when I bring clouds, but as my note highlights, it's the same word twice. So the common Hebrew way, when the verb and noun match, we'll see that in the Tower of Babel, when they brick bricks. So when I cloud clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living being of all flesh, and the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living being of all flesh that is on the earth. Notice the oddness of God speaking in the third person here. So let's pause to look at what's going on here in this emphasis on this sign. We certainly immediately jump to the bow being a rainbow, but this is the only place in the entire Hebrew Bible where the word keshet or keseth is understood to be a rainbow. Let's look at that here from this chart where I brought up several elements of here. And this is a theme I want to look at now, how this passage has military imagery in the closing section. So let's go back one here while I have this on the screen. In 8:21, which is a J part as we understood it, this word was used used to describe what God would never do again, which is to smite, which is used in Genesis 14 and 5, as we'll see in a war story, as what kings do. So as opposed to the word we saw for destroy or corrupt. So I'll never again smite, the way kings do. And then we saw last time the words for fear and dread here, which echoed from Deuteronomy 11:25, the fear and dread, although in slightly different language, that people will have when they're going to war with other peoples. And now we focus on this image, keshet, as the bow. And here's 3 examples of that, both from Genesis and other texts, that you can see how plainly keshet refers to the archer's bow, not a rainbow. Your quiver and your bow, or your sword and your bow, both times there. And not only that, covenant itself is also an expression of a military thing, as the end of hostilities or war. Here's 3 examples from the Hebrew Bible, one from Genesis, of covenant between people has nothing to do with God, but with the end of hostilities. So here with Laban and Jacob, after the whole business with Rachel and Leah, and we'll get to that eventually here, come now, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me, which is the peace terms for Laban and Jacob after their relationship is soured. Similarly, Abner, who had been the chief of staff for Saul, after Saul's death, comes to David and offers to make a covenant. Make your covenant with me, and I will give you my support to bring all Israel over to you. So a covenant between 2 elite people to unite Israel and Judah after war. And then finally in 1 Kings in the time of Solomon. So Yahweh gave Solomon wisdom as he promised. There was peace between Hiram, king of the Phoenicians of Tyre and Sidon, and Solomon, and the 2 of them made a covenant. So these examples, whether between 2 individual people or between 2 leaders of opposing factions or internationally by kings, establish that covenant was traditionally understood as a relationship that would end hostilities or bring peace between different parties. But here God is doing it unilaterally. So in other words, God is offering a peace treaty. And we ought to be both amazed at that, but also perhaps a little suspicious, because when people in dominant power offer the victims a peace treaty, the terms might not always be as equal or as enforceable as one might think. Here in the Pacific Northwest, where I'm speaking and writing from, I think of the indigenous peoples here who were given a treaty in 1851 that has been broken over and over again, in which they certainly didn't understand the terms of. So God is offering this, but who could enforce this against God? We really have to just trust that God would keep this on God's own. And so God in the power position makes this offer to end hostilities between God and humans and the rest of creation. And so what we see in this putting the bow in the clouds, as some scholars have noted, is hanging up God's military bow here. So if the arching bow is a symbol of warfare, and God had previously smited people in anger or in frustration over human disobedience, now God promises not to do that. I will hang up my bow in the sky, and when I see that, I will remember not to do this again. And know what that's saying, that God needs to remind God's own self not to be violent and destructive. And there's something paradoxical about the way it's stated here, because normally the rainbow, as we know, comes when the storm is over, not before the storm starts. It doesn't happen when the clouds come up. It happens when the clouds separate and there's still some rain and some sunshine to allow the refraction, as we know scientifically, that makes rainbows here. So there's something weirdly ironic about the fact that the rainbow would only come too late after the storm had already gone. But this is not Baal, the storm god here, anymore. This is, whether you think of Elohim or Yahweh, as a God who will no longer bring a storm of rain to be destructive. So disclaiming that. And again, one of the differences between the God we see here and what we see in the Babylonian stories, who certainly don't disclaim that kind of power. And so we see at the very center of the chiasm is this promise, and the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. And so verse 16 brings all the pieces together here. Notice how all the different colored elements are brought forth here. When the bow is in the clouds, there's the sign, I will see it and remember. The second time that God's saying remember here, and of course the first remembering was in 8:1, which is more of recalling. This is an anticipation here of this covenant. It's not a remembering of something in the past. I will see and recall the everlasting covenant between myself, but in third person God, and every living being. And then finally, God says to Noah again, noting the parallel here of the God said that frames the whole issue here at the beginning and at the end. This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. So the flood story comes to an end here with this unilateral promise of God, I won't do it again, I promise you. And what is Noah's response to any of this? Again, Noah has been utterly silent throughout this whole thing. And after the next video, when we look at the conclusions we might draw from the flood story, we'll return to the story of Noah and his sons, which has a dark coda, which you may know. We'll get there very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.